The first wave of the Arab Spring didn't spread immediately to Lebanon, but it wasn't long before its effects were being felt here. Over 1.5 million Syrians have taken refuge here since 2011, fleeing the conflict back home. Over the past decade, there were two major protest movements, one in 2011 and one in 2015, which some say foreshadowed what was to come. Although the Lebanese state has been collapsing slowly, one disaster back in October of 2019 was the last straw and triggered national revolt.
A huge crowd just mobilized spontaneously. All Beirut is burning. It looks like a real insurrection.
The economy was stagnating for years. There was no growth and there was no sign of hope.
It's the biggest Ponzi schemes in modern history.
The injuries came from that use of excessive violence and disproportionate violence during the protest.
We can no longer protect ourselves.
It's a criminal act to vote for this political class. Change needs time, and it's a matter of accumulation.
We're going to stay on the streets until we get exactly what we want and what we deserve.
On October 13th of 2019, wildfires broke out in Lebanon's western mountains. The Lebanese government proved incapable of responding adequately. Its firefighting aircraft had broken down and hadn't been repaired. Civilians were left to fight the fires themselves before help arrived from overseas.
During these fires, the parties of the system were blaming each other. The people were organizing the relief and the work, the aid, and this helped people to sense the power of solidarity.
في ناس تشردت من بيوتها في أشجار زيتون، يعني الوضع الاقتصادي خانق الناس.
Frustration at the government of Prime Minister Saad Hariri was mounting, and yet a few days later it announced a highly controversial new tax, a $6 monthly charge on internet messaging apps like WhatsApp and Viber in order to raise state revenues. What, in your opinion, sparked the uprising in October?
The economy was stagnating for years. And so, there was no growth and there was no sign of hope for the future. And add to all of that the political class in one meeting decided that the solution was basically more taxes on an already fatigued population. We saw an outpouring of the population into the streets, more young faces on the street. They showcased unity in different areas, demonstrating at the same time. So there was this sign that we're tired of the same old politics in which we want more transparency, we want good governance, and we want change, we want transition.
Protests aren't uncommon in Beirut, but this time hundreds of thousands of people from across the country took to the streets demanding change. Jean Assir is a political activist and a co-founder of an independent media outlet. When you look back at the uprising, do you have a moment or like a specific memory that's like ingrained in your head that you could tell me about?
The first night, we see a huge crowd that has just mobilized spontaneously. The images coming at the same time from Tripoli, and then the images coming from the south. All Beirut is burning. It's an apocalyptic scene, but it's extremely also joyful in a sense. It looks like a real insurrection.
What you heard on the streets and what you saw sprayed on the walls was that the revolution was female. Lebanese women were at the forefront of the protest, leading, organizing, and fighting back. Sara Murad is an academic with the American University of Beirut and has participated in the protests.
You see the woman kicking the bodyguard in his guts. But also you see women carrying candles, banging pots from even balconies. So there's not just one tactic that women have used in their engagement. It's almost impossible to find an image that doesn't have women in it, but also you see so many iconic images of women. So there was an interest in capturing these moments.
Where does the feminist cause intersect with the October 17 uprising?
You have this objective reality of women's disenfranchisement and dispossession in many ways, and at the same time you have this moment, the spectacle of women's leadership.
How do you feel watching?
To see these images, it's heartwarming. I guess I've never walked in Beirut as much as I did then, and I've never felt my body at peace like this in the streets.
One good message out of that 17 October protest movement was basically it was telling a political class which was using and abusing the sectarian system and sectarian differences for its own good. It was telling them that, look at us, we're not really, that divided.
Ghida Frangieh is a lawyer and one of the founders of the Lawyers Committee for the Defense of Protesters.
We documented all the violence that was targeted against the protesters and people who participated in the uprising. Most of the arrests were targeted in Beirut. The regime tried to repress and contain the uprising as much as it can, and one of the main strategies it used was the use of excessive force during the protest and also the use of mass arrests. So we estimate that we have around 2,000 civilians who were injured during the protest, and we have around 1,200 people who were detained because of their participation in the uprising. We also have some torture and ill treatment that happened inside the detention centers of the army particularly, and that was done to extract information from the protesters. How are you organizing yourselves? Who is funding you?
What kind of injuries would they sustain?
We have 3 people who died during protests. They were shot by army officers. We also have around 25 people who lost their eyesight and a lot of injuries in the back, in the legs. We have people who lost their hearing. Most of the injuries came from that use of excessive violence and disproportionate violence during the protest. The moment that security forces decided to break up a protest, they were using violence indiscriminately, so any bystander could get injured. And we actually do have health providers, media professionals, lawyers, and human rights observers who were injured during some of the protests around the country. Another strategy that the regime used was actually attacks on protesters by the civilian supporters of the ruling parties. That violence was not only used to break up the protest, as they say, but also to punish protesters merely for seeking that political change. It could have been the bodyguards of politicians who shot at protesters. It could have been gangs who actually attacked the sit-ins of protest. The most famous one was in Beirut on the day that the Prime Minister Hariri resigned. But we had similar attacks on sit-ins in the south and in the north and in Mount Lebanon as well. The lawyer's tent was on the Martyrs Square at the beginning, and then it moved here to the Azariya parking. And when it was attacked on 29 October by the Amal and Hezbollah supporters, we had to rebuild the tent.
This is generally the spot where all of the tents would be laid and all the civil society organizations would be set up. There would be the Red Cross, the Lawyers Association. There was even like a psychological health tent here, and now it's completely empty. And I haven't been here since the uprising. It has a totally different spirit. It's like it's a totally different place. 13 days after the protest started, Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri stepped down.
استقالتي بحطها بتصرف فخامة الرئيس وكل اللبنانيين.
The uprising continued. Demonstrators said his resignation was not enough.
We are still here, we're still fighting, and we're going to stay on the streets until we get exactly what we want and what we deserve.
The regime in Lebanon, it's not a government, it's not the state. It's the parties, the ruling parties. Each has his own economic and political state within the area of where they rule and control. Very well rooted in the society, in the economy, in the state.
To better understand Lebanon, we have to take a look at its history. Between 1975 and 1990, this place witnessed a brutal civil sectarian war that saw over 120,000 people killed and more than 1 million Lebanese displaced. The war ended with a power-sharing agreement between the Muslims and the Christians, backed by Syria and Saudi Arabia, which saw the Syrian forces occupying the country. Saudi-backed Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri at the time had begun the process of rebuilding Lebanon's post-war economy, but then he was assassinated in 2005. His death left Hezbollah to be extremely powerful in the region. And they're now seen as not only part of, but guardians of what is called the Lebanese regime, or the Lebanese political elite who have shamelessly taken advantage of this weakened state. Iranian-backed Hezbollah has consistently prevented the establishment from falling. When the 2019 uprising started, the group's leader Hassan Nasrallah chose not to back the protesters.
عم تضيعوا وقتكم وعم تتعبوا حالكم وعم تتعبوا البلد وعم بتضيعوا وقت البلد وهذا توقيت خاطئ والعهد ما فيكم تسقطوه.
What role did Hezbollah play?
When we talk about Hezbollah, we are talking about the most powerful side or the most powerful party in the regime. Actually, it's the anchor of this regime now.
Hezbollah played a huge role in the counter-revolution and in leading the counter-revolution. I mean, violently, by sending Hezbollah's guys to beat protesters. That's an undeniable reality. Hezbollah is not an exception. It's pretty much like every other sectarian party that has benefited from the system and is perpetuating the same dynamic of the civil war by being a militia that uses its own power to crack down on other people whenever they're unhappy with it.
Up until today, we haven't seen any accountability for all this indiscriminate violence that we saw on the streets. Not one investigation was opened, not one complaint has been followed through. Neither the judiciary nor the security forces have done any transparent and public mechanism of accountability for all this violence that we saw.
The Lebanese army took the permission from the president to come and shoot live bullets against us. We can no longer protect ourselves.
This movement was not just about politicians. At the heart of the protests was anger at Lebanon's banks. Access to savings accounts was illegally blocked, and so were foreign transfers, and the Lebanese currency has lost more than 80% of its value in a year. In March 2020, the country defaulted on a key foreign debt obligation, crippling the economy further. Lebanon's economic collapse made all sections of the society poorer, even those living abroad whose savings evaporated overnight. Maurice Assis has been protesting outside Lebanon's central bank. Like many other parents, he's no longer able to send money to his son who's studying overseas.
طلاب عم يترفضوا من الجامعات، عم ينشحطوا من الشقق اللي اخدينها. نايمين بالشوارع. قاعد تشوف اشياء بحياتك ولك ما حدا مجربها بعد. وأنا عسكري متقاعد، بقبض $1,600,000، $200. عندي ولدين. طب كيف بدي اودي لهم؟ منين بدي اودي لهم؟ الحال بدنا نحكي مع الشباب القوى الأمنية، بركي بيحسوا معنا ويفتحوا لنا هالبوابة لنفوت لاي لجوا لألقط بإخوانيهم. هذا الحل.
Dima Krayem is an economic researcher and has been following the rapid decline of Lebanon's public finances. For the average person, it felt like there was like a sort of turning point at some point because it all came crashing down
This post-war economic model did not survive out of, meticulous governance and prudent management over the past few decades. Instead, it survived through broadcasting false confidence and resuscitation conferences in which we promised structural reforms that never materialized in exchange for bailing out the system. It's always described as an economy in crisis.
I mean, did they not see this coming? Or did they see this coming and they were like, this works for us?
There were enough signs that an imminent collapse was coming. Growth estimates were faltering, capital inflows were faltering, so you had a decrease in bank deposits. The gains of this model seldom trickle down. This happens against a backdrop of staunch inequality. People's deposits are at BDL largely due to the 2016 financial engineering schemes. Those deposits have largely been wiped out and used to defend the peg, to finance current expenditure, and also for debt servicing. This is why it's one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in modern history.
And just like that, people lost their savings and their pensions for retirement.
كان عندك مصاري لإلك عم تشتغلي كل عمرك تشيليهم تحطيهم على جنب لآخرتي بحال مرضتي بحال قعدتي بلا شغل بحال عزتي هودي كلهم سرقون أخذوهم هن عم يضحكوا يعني ومبسوطين وبعضهم على كراسيهم كلهم نص الشعب بهيك بفل واللي بده يخضع اللي باقي النص الثاني يعني بده يعيش مثل ما هالخطة مرسومة لهالعالم يعني أكثر شيء هلا صارت فرحته إنه يقدر يصيد سمكة.
With repeated lockdowns because of the COVID-19 pandemic, many were asking if 2020 could get any worse. Then one day in early August came a catastrophe no one saw coming, but those in power should have. I was in my bedroom when I heard the initial sound, and I opened my balcony doors only to have my room collapse around me. And I think if you were in Beirut, your story is similar to mine. If you survived physically unscathed, then you were probably at the right place at the right time. From this viewpoint, it's painfully obvious how massive the scale of the damage has been on Beirut. And you could also see the silos in the distance. 204 people were killed and more than 7,500 injured. And just like the wildfires, it was largely left to the Lebanese people to clean up the mess because the state wasn't there to protect or help its citizens. For the Lebanese people, the explosion confirmed what many already suspected. The political system had failed beyond repair. In the weeks which followed, it became clear that customs workers, the port, and state officials had known about the extremely hazardous chemicals for years, but did nothing.
We're all volunteering here since day one of the explosion.
It's really sad to see that our government is doing nothing towards these people. Yeah. They tell us you, the young people, you are the government, you are the ministers.
You should be all presidents. And
yeah, you should be proud. Go. You should be proud with what we are doing now. So this gives us the only motivation we need to continue working and helping rebuild Beirut. Honestly, we can say that we are blind about our future. Only sure about that we will try to change. We will do the work to change this country.
نحن لوين رايحين؟
طبعا على جهنم.
Within days, the shock of the explosion turned to rage and disgust. And some of the most violent protests in recent Lebanese history.
لك يا اخوة الشرطة تنتم عفوا والنساء والعالم بالبحر
Given the state's negligence, which was widely believed to be the cause of the blast, as well as the complete lack of support in its aftermath, there is no faith in any official investigation. Prime Minister Hassan Diab, who'd replaced Hariri, resigned soon after and promised a fast investigation.
التحقيق لازم يكون أولوية ونتائجه لازم تكون سريعة.
Now, supposedly, the same people who might have caused the blast are going to be the ones who are investigating it. Could you tell us more about the situation legally, what this means?
We have very serious concern about the investigation into the blast. And so far, we think that we do not have elements to reach a good conclusion and to actually have a fair trial. The special prosecutor has a huge conflict of interest in this case. He was investigating the explosive material right before the explosion, and he has a family relationship with one of the most prominent suspects in this case, who was a former Minister of Public Works. Up until now, none of the ministers have been interrogated as suspects, and there seems to be no intention to actually sue and accuse the high political leaders who were responsible for this blast. They are limiting the investigation to small agents, small public agents and officers so far.
Spirits are completely crushed. How do you get back up after something like that happens?
I will just say it. I will not choose, I will just not sugarcoat it. It's a sense of revenge. I mean, it's not justice that I want at this stage. It's revenge, really. And not revenge in any barbaric way, but it's for me, I want to have the satisfaction, not just of justice, but of us winning politically.
So we're headed to Tripoli right now. It's one of the most ancient cities in the region, but it's also one that has been most neglected by the state, which has resulted in it being one of the most impoverished cities in the Mediterranean. Right here is Tripoli's train station. It used to run all the way to central Beirut, to Mar Mikhael. It even linked to Aleppo in Syria. But it was heavily damaged by the civil war, and it was abandoned by the Lebanese state in 1975. It's crazy for me to think that, first of all, the state of public transportation in the 1970s is better than it is today. And second of all, it's crazy to think that somebody's still getting paid for running the trains in Lebanon that are so obviously out of function. Ibrahim Lashin felt his life in Lebanon had become hopeless, so he tried to escape. He paid 5 million Lebanese lira, around $800 US, to hitch a ride on a fishing boat bound for Cyprus.
بدي اخذك معي فرجيكي طرابلس، ما تخافي.
أجيني طرابلس.
في عالم هون هيك شوي صغيرة معهم سلاح وعندهم شباب وكذا، مستلمين هالنقطة ما حمانك شايفة يسافروا في سياراتهم بالنص، عاملينها كرجل أنا. هيك بدك تعيشي بهذا البلد، بدك تعيشي تكوني حاطة فرد على خصرك وبدك تمشي، إذا واحد قال لك مرحبا تشيلي تقوصي.
أنت قد إيه عمرك؟
22.
تغيرت عليك طرابلس بآخر السنين ولا إنه طول عمرها هيك؟
لك إذا يكون معي 5000 بجيبتي تقضيني جمعة، شو هلا 100,000 ما بتجيب لك علبة لبنة وكرتونة بيض وركتين خبز على البيت؟ يا بدك تبيعي مخدرات، يا بدك تبيعي سلاح، يا بدك تبيعي شيء هيك غير شرعي أو غير مقبول يعني بالمجتمع حتى يصير معك مصاري أو حتى تعيشي. أنا بدي أعيش بكرامتي، إذا ببلدي ما عم بقدر أعيش بكرامتي، شو بدي ضلني بعد قاعد عم بعمل هون؟
شو صار معك بالبحر؟ شو القصص اللي هالقد يعني إنه تتذكرهم ما تنساهم بحياتك؟
من شو نقصوا 15 واحد منها هيني قدام عيونك، يعني هيدا عم بيموت وهيدي ماتت وهيدا كبيناه بالبحر وهيدي كبيناها بالبحر، وين بدك تروحي فيهم؟ بس انت واقفه هون وهيدا البحر كلياته عم تطلع ريحتهم عم ينفخوا، جربت غرق حالي، قلت خلص بدي اموت ما بقى فيني، انا يئست اكثر من هيك ما عاد قادر احمل يعني وفي حدا ينشال من هيك مطرح مستحيل. عم بلتفت هيك عم بطلع لوراي قام لقيت برجة كتير كبيرة. حاولت صفر لهم صرخ لهم عيط لهم هيك قام شافوني. أنا في معي مركب هون بيتروى عليه تقريبا 30-40 شخص حيموتوا، بدنا مين يساعدهم؟
When the protests spread to Tripoli, it marked a turning point. For years, the city had been a center of fundamentalist Islam in Lebanon and almost seemed separate from the rest of the country. During the uprising, Tripoli was nicknamed the bride of the revolution.
أنت شاركت بالثورة شيء تبع 17 تشرين؟ ليش شاركت فيها؟
قالنا بركي بيتغير شيء، بركي بيصير شيء، بركي بناخد أمل جديد، بركي بنوصل لحل، بركي بنعمل أي شيء. هي
كان عندك أمل أكتر، هلا ما عاد عندك؟
هلا ما عاد عندي أمل، هلا زيرو. هلا فوق الحادثة كلياتها اللي صارت معي وبالبحر ومات عالم وصدمة وحالة اكتئاب و إلى آخره، برجع بروح على البحر. بس أحسن ما أكون قاعد هون هيك طول النهار عم بموت، هلا آخر نهار بتطلع روحي، وهلا بتطلع روحي، ما في حدا عم يتمنى الموت هون بطرابلس قد شعب طرابلس. هلا يفتحوا لطرابلس هجرة بطريقة شرعية ورسمية على 24 ما بتلاقي بقى حدا هون.
COVID made a perilous economic situation even worse.
هذا سوق شعبي، أغلبية الناس اللي هي وضع المعيشة على قدها بتيجي على هذا السوق تشتري. طبعا اليوم حتى هذا المواطن اللي هو وضعه على قده ما بقى فيه يشتري من البيت يعني. هيدي المدينة هون بسموها أم الفقير، نحن طرابلس عنا هون، لأنه نحن مدينة منسية، نحن هون ما حدا بيفكر فينا، ما حدا بيهتم بهالمدينة. أنا بشتغل شوفير أوتوكار، بسبب الكورونا ما بقى في ترميز، جمعة بيعلموا جمعة ما بيعلموا، في عندك أكثر من 1000 أوتوكار 2000 أوتوكار هون واقعين بهيدي المشكلة، وهي إنه سياراتهم وقفت وما عم يشتغلوا ولا عم يعملوا شيء.
أنت قد إيه صار لك عم تشتغل هون؟
هون بالسوق هون أنا كان عمري 7 سنين.
شو تغير عليك هالسنة؟
كل سنة بنقول السنة المتأمل بالسنة اللي بعدها أحلى، كل سنة بنقول الدنيا تطورت وبيجيبوا لنا رئيس أضرب من رئيس وزعيم أضرب من زعيم ونائب أضرب من نائب، كلهم قرطة حرومية بحرومية، عروس السطع.
In Beirut, busy shopping streets like Hamra have been quiet for months. Thousands of companies and shops closed down during lockdown. Many will never reopen again. Banks are now fortified and customers need to be escorted inside by security. Key government buildings are now encircled by high walls. Ironically, Saad Hariri is back to form a government, after getting the support of a thin majority of members in Lebanon's parliament who ignored the will of the protest movement.
تشكيل حكومة اختصاصيين من غير الحزبيين.
It's extremely insulting to see Hariri back, and extremely painful to see him back a year after, like exactly a year after. And after half, the city was completely blown up.
Where do we go from here?
I mean, our homework remains the same. As tragic as the situation is, and I mean, organizing. That's the only way we can resist that regime, in a sense. But then if we're unable to mobilize on the ground and to be able to translate our common interests into political battles through political structures that are called parties and syndicates and so on, and neighborhood groups and like all forms of organizing, we won't be able to move forward.
So we need a foundation.
We need the base, yeah, we need an infrastructure. We need to build that political infrastructure.
For the protest movement, there's a promising sign of hope. All the major sectarian parties in Lebanon are heavily involved in university politics, and the election results are often regarded as strong indicators for the general support for them during those years.
Any small change matters in this country, be it the university elections, be it small elections in like the order of engineers or any other elections in the country. The youth are going to change what this country is in the next 10 years or so. So this is very integral for us.
This year, the secular student clubs won a massive percentage of seats in all faculties in 3 major universities in Lebanon with an unprecedented landslide. This has been welcomed by many as an encouraging symbol of change.
We sort of won the battle of ideas to a large extent in defining our opponent and also saying that we need radical change. Reforms are no longer useful and can no longer do the job.
We are seeing a change in politics that we have to look at from the bigger picture and not think of the immediate results. Some sectors of the population, there's now the thinking it's a criminal act to vote for this political class. Change needs time, and it's a matter of accumulation. the protest movement is done, I think that the independent chair in any parliament, if you're having elections now, will be substantially bigger than it was in the past. You know, this exclusivity of the Lebanese political system in the past will no longer exist. I see this change as a first step, as a good one in the positive direction.